Hello, MCU fans! With Phase 5 officially ending with the release of Ironheart, it's time to do a summary of the entire Phase 5 timeline. Now, I've done several videos over the years talking about each of the individual shows and movies and how they fit in the timeline, with most recently the release of Ironheart, but now it's time to put everything together. Now, there will be some spoilers for these entries because you can't talk about the timelines without talking about the overall plots, but in case you haven't seen a given entry, I will do them in sections and you can avoid anything that you haven't seen yet. So, lots to discuss. Let's dive right in and see what we can find out. Don't forget, we have a July contest running all month long. Be a subscriber, leave a comment. You could win a book or a steelbook. Best of luck. And we have a membership option with lots of cool perks, so you might check it out in case you're interested. Plus, hang around to the end of the video, and we'll talk about the Doomsday Countdown rewatch on the Discord. Alright, so as a reminder right up front, the timeline book is the official canon timeline for everything from phases 1 through 4. So that means everything released up to and including the Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special has an official timeline placement. And the Guardians Holiday Special is in December of 2025. It's also worth noting that the Disney Plus timeline is considered canon because executive producer Brad Winderbaum stated that Disney Plus actually became the statement just by rearranging those tiles. That is our medium to define canon now, which is wild to think about. So that means that the order we see here is official canon. However, I'm not going to use it as a crutch for this video, and instead we're going to look at each entry for timeline hints. So these entries were part of Phase 4. I'm not going to talk about those, but everything here I'm going to talk about in the video and where they fit in the overall timeline. It's also worth noting that I'm going to do a special section on anything that has multiversal connections. So that includes the ending of the Marvels, Deadpool and Wolverine, the ending of Quantumania, and also Loki Season 2 and What If Seasons 2 and 3. Alright, so let's kick things off with I Am Groot, which continues the story of Baby Groot right after Guardians Volume 2. So the only thing I really want to mention here is the Watcher's appearance was a pretty big deal, right? He shows up, says, "I'm the Watcher, your guide through the vast realities of time." And I thought it was kind of fun that it seemed the Baby Groot might be able to see him. He's like, "Can he see me?" No, he can't. I'm a fifth-dimensional being. And then at the end, when he says, "Go forth, you little seedling. I know you'll make us proud." Once again, he's like, well, how does he keep doing that? So personally, I think they were just being funny and it's random that he's seeing the Watcher, but I would also love it if somehow Baby Groot is able to see a fifth-dimensional being. So pretty easy one to place, right? All we need to do is just basically add Season 2. But it is worth noting that means the Watcher was observing the sacred timeline, 616, before the loom was destroyed. And we'll talk more about that when we get to Loki. All right, so now Echo. Also a pretty easy one to take care of. So it starts with some flashbacks of Maya in Hawkeye, which we know is in December of 2024. And then it tells us 5 months later. So, okay, we're definitely in a May time frame, according to this graphic at least. But also we do see some posters that mention May. We see some of the kids getting ready for the Tamaha summer camp, which would make sense if it was in late May, maybe early June time frame. And one of the big occurrences in the series is the powwows. They're happening in Oklahoma, particularly Tamaha, Oklahoma, and they even tell us Haskell County in Tamaha, Oklahoma. So when do these powwows happen? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't help us very much because they pretty much happen all year. So we're just going to have to stick with the late May, early June timeframe from everything we've seen. And that fits well with the fact that in the very end, we see Kingpin watching the New York City mayor's race. IRL, there is a New York City mayor's race coming up in November of 2025. And we hear the newscasters saying there's no doubt it's late in the process. So that would fit with this being a May-June timeframe. Of course, we're going to see the Kingpin does not end up running for mayor yet, but we'll get to that when we get to Daredevil. All right, so Echo's pretty easy. Her last appearance was in Hawkeye, and now her show is happening from May to June of 2025. All right, so on to Ironheart. So Riri was last seen in Wakanda Forever, which is in May of 2025, and she was told by Shuri, "Your suit, it's a great design, but we can't let you leave with it." So she returns to MIT to work on it. But unfortunately, this scene was in the trailer, but not in the show itself. And I say unfortunately because it had this awesome date, 7/25 of 2025. But I think we can still use it. So hold on to this thought. We'll return to this in just a minute. All right, so Riri returns to MIT to work on her suit over the summer because we see these trees are looking very green. Here's some more trees that are very green. And then she heads in and works on this suit for many months. So I'm guessing that 7/25/2025 did happen. It was just over summer, and she worked on the suit all the way into the fall semester. We know that because she's in school when she is expelled. You're expelling me, she says. Yes, effective immediately. And we learn that she's been there for over 4 years, so she's going into her 5th year at MIT. However, she has no true matriculation towards a degree. Now, we know that she graduated from high school in 2020, which actually tells us a couple things. Number one, she wasn't blipped, but number two, that means if she's been in college for 5 years, we're definitely in 2025. But the question is, when? When in 2025? Well, we see that once she returns to Chicago, it is most definitely a fall setting. We see continual trees that have their leaves having changed colors, and in many cases, even having lost their leaves. It's very consistent that this show is placed in early or mid-fall of 2025. But then we do get some very specific dates in relation to Rampage's death. In particular, he died on 9/22/2025, and his autopsy was 2 days later, 9/24/2025. Then we're told that a few weeks have passed. She was dumpster diving a few weeks ago, and now you're buying expensive headphones. And then finally they tell us it's the hottest day in October. All right, so this timeline's coming together really well. We started in late September, moved a few weeks forward, and now we're probably in early or mid-October. And then these posters are very consistent with an October time frame. This one talks about a harvest festival, October 31st, and this one talks about a Slam IM teen poetry competition on Saturday, November 1st. And it is worth noting that November 1st is a Saturday in 2025. And then I love this. Zeke's license plate is 5/25. Now, that means it's expired. So Zeke, you got to get that thing renewed. But we get 2025, right? But also, in Illinois, they have different colored stickers for each year. And notice that for 2025, it's orange. So yeah, they even got the right color sticker because this was filmed in 2022, so that would have been magenta. And even these flowers work. I admit I was a little worried at first, but they turn out to be black-eyed Susans, and sure enough, black-eyed Susans bloom from early to late summer, specifically June through October. So yeah, everything is working out so nicely. But unfortunately, there is a small timeline issue that we have to point out, and it happens in episode 3. So remember I was talking about she was dumpster diving for a few weeks, and now she's buying expensive headphones? Well, right after that scene, she's informed that Mr. Williams, Rampage, has died. And in fact, she's told he was found dead this morning. Now, keep in mind, Rampage died on 9/22, but they must have found his body pretty quickly because they did the autopsy by 9/24. And since the police are telling him he was found dead this morning, that means this scene has to be happening on 9/22. Well, here's the problem. The very next scene after that, that would be when they say it's the hottest day in October. And obviously it can't both be October and 9/22. So yeah, I think we're just going to have to move the entire show into October and say that this date of Rampage's death is wrong. Bummer, but otherwise a very, very good timeline. All right, so now we can add in Ironheart, and I'm going to place it in October of 2025. If you think it should also be in September, let me know your thoughts on that, but I'm going to keep it in October of 2025. All right, so now we move on to Quantumania. And again, we're not going to cover the post-credit scene. I'm going to do that when I get to the multiverse section. But for the rest of the movie, it's really pretty easy because we get this July 24th date for when Scott Lang is doing a book reading. This is probably not part of his book tour. I think that's finished by now, but he's doing a book reading at a library. So wow, July 24th. That is awesome, right? And then in the final scene of the movie where they're celebrating Cassie's birthday, I'm guessing maybe a couple days or at most a week has gone by. Because notice on the left, you see his injuries he sustained in the quantum realm. And on the right, you can see those injuries are still healing up. So, okay, the movie takes place in July, but what year? Unfortunately, the movie does not tell us that. But they do give us a good hint here, because Scott says Endgame was a few years ago. He says it's been a crazy few years for everyone. Now keep in mind, couple is 2, so few is normally 3 or more. So 3 years from Endgame would put us in 2026. And then we do get another indicator that we're probably in 2026 because we learn that Cassie is now 18 years old. According to Peyton Reed, she was 6 in the first movie and 9 in the second, and now she's 18. So let's try to track Cassie's age and see if that firmly places us in 2026. So in the first Ant-Man movie, which was July to August of 2015, Cassie is 6. Now the movie doesn't tell us how old she is, but it does tell us it's her birthday. But in Quantumania, she says, "Dad, a guy dressed like a bee tried to kill me in my room when I was 6. And of course, she's referring to Yellow Jacket attacking. So okay, they're definitely saying she was 6 in Ant-Man. Then we learn in Ant-Man and the Wasp that she is, well, at least now, 9. Because in Scott Lang's book, Look Out for the Little Guy, he says, if there's one thing that improves a house arrest, it's a beloved family member, ideally of the under 10 variety. So I think this is kind of a retcon, because in the movie itself, Scott said, hey, you try and entertain a 10-year-old when you can't leave the house. You know the lengths I've gone to? Close-up magic. I learned that. So he actually said she's 10 in the movie, but now they've changed it to 9, so maybe we have to think about the movie as just he made a mistake. So okay, she's 9 in Ant-Man and the Wasp. In Avengers Endgame, that would make her 15, because that's October of 2023. So then that means Quantumania has to be in July of 2026 for Cassie to be age 18. And here's another interview where Peyton Reed was saying Cassie's going to be 18 in this movie. And actually, we do get some evidence she must be 18 because she's held at the San Francisco County Jail, which you're not sent to a jail unless you're 18. Plus, she was held in a cell with other adults, and they would not do that with a minor. Okay, so that means Cassie's age progression would look like this, assuming she's born in July of 2008. So, all right, it all works out. That means we must be in July of 2026. So now we just need to add it to the timeline. We need a line coming out of Avengers Endgame for Ant-Man and the Ant family. And now we are officially into the Phase 5 page, put in Quantumania, and it is in July of 2026. Okay, so now on to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. So we know it takes place after the holiday special, and since that happened in December of 2025, the movie has to be in 2026. But what month? Well, there aren't many indicators in the movie. In fact, the only things I could find are at the very end in this St. Charles Post newspaper. So first of all, it mentions alien abduction. Kevin Bacon shares all, which is pretty funny. That's referring to when he was, of course, kidnapped in the holiday special. And it's also worth noting there's this article here about Lola the Puggle winning Best in Show. Now, Lola was James Gunn's dog that unfortunately passed away, but I'm bringing this up to say it seems like there's a lot of important information in this newspaper. So, let's take a look at this bottom article on the newspaper. Notice that it says, bad weather won't keep public at bay, festival to continue. So, is there a festival in St. Charles, Missouri? Why, yes, there is. There's the Festival of the Little Hills. Notice that it's held annually on the third full weekend in August. This St. Charles mainstay commemorates the city's founding by inviting more than 350,000 people for a 3-day celebration. So this isn't some rinky-dink little festival. It's a big deal. Therefore, I'm going to go with August of 2026 for the movie's timeline placement. Now, it is worth noting the Groot's growth patterns are quite the mystery. I mean, if you look at the middle there, Thor Love and Thunder, which is October 2025, he's basically looks like a teenager, right? But by the time of the Guardians holiday special, just 2 months later, he's ballooned to that monstrous size, which he's also that size in August 2026 for Guardians 3. But it is worth noting that even in that holiday special, Kraglin himself said, oh, Groot? He's just a kid. Well, he's calling him a kid even though he looks like that. So we just have to let it go. Groot is a living tree, and he has giant spurts, and there's just no more we can say about it, right? He hit tree puberty, basically, between Love and Thunder and the holiday special. All right, so let's get this on the timeline. In the lower left-hand corner is the Guardians holiday special. We need a line coming out of there. Then we move to the Phase 5 page, and now we have Guardians of the Galaxy, August of 2026. Very nice. Okay, so now on to Secret Invasion. So this show takes place 30 years after the Captain Marvel movie, which was in June of 1995. I say that because there are a ton of references back to the movie. Carol Danvers and Nick Fury promised to find them a new planet. It started 30 years ago when the Skrulls found Earth. We get this mention of 30 years of hands-on experience with the Skrulls. Also, people have been walking in exile for 30 years. Talos says, 30 years? You still don't know me better than that? Gravik says we wandered in the shadows for 30 years because he was weak. And Nick Fury says, I've been cleaning up your poop for the last 30-some years. Now, everywhere else it just said 30 years, which would make us think, okay, June of 2025. But this at least opens the door that it could be longer than that when Fury said 30-some years. But for now, we don't know the year for certain. Could be 2025, could be 2026. All right, so Nick Fury has been off-world for the past few years. Now remember, couple means 2, so normally few is 3 or more. So this would kind of indicate 3 years from 2023, i.e. 2026. And then we have Talos saying, oh, it's too heavy here, man. I got to go up to my space station. You've been up there for years. And then finally Fury says, it's been years since the blip. Okay, so none of this gives us any definitive answer, but I'm kind of leaning more towards 2026 at this point. However, the good news is episode 1 does give us a specific month and even day, because they mention the attack is planned for tomorrow, Unity Day. So, Unity Day is every 4th of November. It's an annual Russian holiday, always on November 4th. So, okay, we're in November. And in fact, the leaves in Russia do look like fall, so that works. Although I will point out that the weather in America does not seem like November. Now, granted, you can't always count on things like the trees because this may be when it was filmed, but not trying to indicate when it's happening in the timeline. But just something to keep in mind. Now, I will mention that some of the props dealing with when Ritson went to the hospital seem to indicate an October timeframe. And a big shout out to Chris on the Discord for pointing this stuff out to me. So first of all, in the upper right-hand corner, maybe that date is October, but it's so sloppy we can't really tell. But in the lower left-hand corner, that definitely looks like 10/21, which would indicate October. Also, it is worth pointing out that Ritson got his last tetanus shot in 2020, indicating he wasn't blipped. And that's going to be helpful for later discussion, so hold on to that thought. Okay, so here's some more props that seem to indicate an October time frame. We have this prop, which is a case report and has a date of 7/14. And then we have here where it's saying, look at the case report 3 months ago. Well, 3 months from July would be October. So it seems like we could go October or November, but I'm going to stick with November because of the Unity Day reference. But what year? What year is this thing happening? Well, here's our big indicator. So Ritson talks about the bill that designates all off-world-born species as enemy combatants. And remember, he said, we will kill every last one of you. So basically, the president was saying, kill every alien. And in fact, we saw it happening. They gunned down this guy, who actually did turn out to be a Skrull. But they also gunned down this lady, who turned out to be human. So yeah, they were killing people left and right. And this, remember, is in a November timeframe. Well, I don't see any possible way that this could have happened before the Guardians holiday special, because you have Mantis and Drax walking around town, everybody's taking pictures with them, etc. No one's trying to shoot them. They're going to bars and hanging out, they're dancing all night long, and even when the police had a chance to shoot them, they said, I don't know what's going on here, but you need to back up or I'll shoot. No, with Ritson's order, they would have said, okay, I'm just shooting you. And then throw in the fact that Kevin Bacon, while he did have some initial concerns, ultimately wasn't real bothered about being abducted by aliens. So I'm going to go with November of 2026 because I don't see any way Ritson's edict could have been prior to the holiday special. And then one other thing we do learn is that Ritson is in the first term of his presidency. And that works fine because if this is November of 2026, the next election is not until November 7th of 2028. Well, sort of. We're going to find out some craziness with that presidential election. But for now, this puts us a good 2 years before he would be up for election again. All right, so let's put this on the timeline. So first we have Ross, who was last seen in Wakanda Forever, and then we have Fury, Hill, and Talos, who were all last seen in Far From Home. So now we move to the Phase 5 page, and we can add Secret Invasion in November 2026 and bring in our connections. All right, so now on to the Marvels. So at the beginning of the movie, we see that Carol destroys the Supreme Intelligence. And I'm guessing that that's probably around June of 1995, shortly after the Captain Marvel movie. Because in that movie, she says, tell the Supreme Intelligence that I'm coming to end it. The war, the lies, all of it. So presumably she would have done it soon after the movie. So I'm going to go with June of 1995. The reason that's important is, as Carol destroys the Supreme Intelligence, Dar-Benn is watching. And then Dar-Benn says, for 30 years, I've been fighting alongside you. So that places us 30 years after 1995, so we're at least in 2025. So then the question is, does the Marvels happen before or after Secret Invasion? Because Nick Fury basically has 3 appearances post-Endgame, Far From Home, Secret Invasion, and the Marvels. Well, Samuel L. Jackson himself said the series has to happen so the Marvels can happen. All these things are connected in an interesting sort of way. And he's correct, because Talos mentions, I sent out a call to every Skrull that isn't in Emperor Drozha's colony, and they answered, meaning Drozha's colony is not yet on Earth. Also, when Fury's talking to Vara, he says the Kree said they're open to peace talks with the Skrulls. I need your help. And she's like, my help? And he's like, yeah, with this, peace summit. You're the best diplomat the Skrulls have ever had. So we know a peace summit is coming up. And then in the Marvels, we see Carol contacting Fury, and she says it's the Kree. They're going after the Skrulls on Tarnax. But he cautions this is a peace and reconciliation tour. That means the peace talks have not yet occurred. And in fact, we see that Tarnax is a Skrull refugee colony, and it is ruled by Emperor Droge. He says the Skrull have been scattered to every corner of the universe, to which Dar-Benn says, I hear you, Droge. And then, of course, ultimately, after Dar-Ben's attack, Droge and the remaining Skrulls are rescued by Valkyrie, who takes them back to New Asgard. So the Marvels has to happen after Secret Invasion because of all those connections Samuel Jackson was referring to. So since Secret Invasion is in November of 2026, and this seems to be right after Secret Invasion, that means it's November of 2026. But does this work with everyone's ages in the movie? So 2 characters' ages are given. Let's start with Kate Bishop. So we have Kamala saying, "Did you think you're the only kid superhero in the world?" And she says, "Well, I'm 23. Okay, so that means November 2026, she's 23. In the Hawkeye show, she said she's 22, and that's December of 2024. Also in the Hawkeye show, we learned that she's a senior. All right, so let's put all this together and see if we can get it to work. So Kate is 22 on December 20th of 2024 during the Hawkeye show, meaning she was born between December 21st of 2001 and December 20th of 2002. We know that Kate is a college senior in December of 2024, meaning her kindergarten year was September of 2008 to June of 2009. And we know in New York, you start kindergarten on the year that you're 5 on December 1st. This means she was 5 on December 1st of 2008, thus meaning she was born between December 2nd, 2002 and December 1st of 2003. So if we put all this together, that means her birthday is sometime between December 2nd and December 20th of 2002. And yes, that means she would just be 23 in November of 2026. So yay! Kate's birthday works perfectly in November of 2026. But does this work for Kamala? Okay, so we know she's 16 in September 2025, which is during the Miss Marvel show, because, she says she's 16. We also learn that she's in her junior year. Okay, that's good information. So that means in November 2026, she would be a senior. So that works perfect because we saw her, not doing her science studies and her mother's calling up after her. And this fits with the fact that she's still in high school because they joke about the fact that if Monica doesn't save her, she's not going to be able to graduate. All right, so then we learned from the director that she's a 16-year-old girl in the movie. And in fact, in the movie itself, they mention that she's 16 because she has this graphic where she lists herself as 16. But does this all work? Well, let's go through the facts. So Kamala mentions she's 16 in an episode that the wiki dates at September 16th of 2025. Aman Vellani said that Kamala survived the blip, meaning she was born between September 17th of 2008 and September 16th of 2009. Kamala is said to be in her junior year in the 2025 to 2026 school year. And in New Jersey, you start kindergarten on the year that you're 5 on October 1st. This means she was 5 on October 1st, 2014, thus meaning she was born between October 2nd, 2008 and September 16th of 2009. So the bottom line is, if the movie's occurring in November of 2026, Kamala would definitely be 17 years old. So a couple of different ways we could go with this. Could be this graphic is wrong, and she really should be 17. But honestly, I have a couple other issues with the movie being in November. I mean, this weather does not look like November. And granted, you can't always rely on that. But I mean, on the right, the dude's in a short sleeve shirt having a picnic. The trees look green and it's November? That just doesn't work for me. Plus, keep in mind that Secret Invasion even had weather that didn't really look like November. So is it possible that Unity Day is not something we can rely upon? I mean, Marvel's been kind of shaky with holidays and special events outside the U.S. For example, in the Shang-Chi movie, they originally did not have the movie placed during the actual Qingming Festival, even though it's mentioned multiple times in the movie. Now, they did fix it for the timeline book, but they had it wrong for a while. Then there's the Far From Home reference to the Prague Festival of Lights, but it's not even when the actual Festival of Lights occurs. And then the Miss Marvel show placed the Eid celebrations in September, even though they should have been much earlier in the year. So, okay, is it possible the Marvel ignored when the actual Unity Day is happening? All right, so let's get this thing on the timeline, and then we can talk a little bit more about the placement. So WandaVision was the last appearance of Monica, and Miss Marvel show was the last appearance of Kamala and Carol. So, okay, so we can add the Marvels, and here's our appearance for Monica, and then here's Carol and Kamala, and of course, here's Nick Fury. Now, we could go with November of 2026, and I suspect a lot of people are going to do that, and I totally respect that if that's what you do. I'm going to, though, go with September, because if it's in mid-September, it actually works with Kamala's birthday, and that would move back Secret Invasion to August-September timeframe, which would work better with the weather. And actually, we're going to see that Agatha All Along works a little better if these are placed in the September timeframe. So, speaking of Agatha All Along, let's place it in the timeline. So first we have to figure out, when did Agatha come to Westview? She says, "Oh, when I sensed this place, the afterglow of so many spells cast all at once." So basically she came right after Wanda first cast a spell in Westview. Okay, so then we need to figure out, when did that happen? So we know that Endgame happened in fall of 2023, and we know that WandaVision is also in fall of 2023. But that doesn't help. We got to narrow this down to a month. Well, thank goodness for Miss Marvel's show, because on her wall that's a memorial to the fallen heroes, if we zoom in, it tells us they came back in October of 2023. And that perfectly aligns with Marvel Studios Canada that tweeted out that today, October 17th, 2023, the Avengers assembled to fight Thanos. Okay, so that means everyone returned from the blip on October 17th. All right, then in WandaVision, we learned that it was 3 weeks later when Monica headed over to Westview. And in fact, that aligns perfectly with this calendar from the 4th episode of WandaVision, which matches November of 2023. So we can actually get down to the exact days of the creation and collapse of the Hex. So the wiki says it's from Monday, November 6th to Saturday, November 11th. So why does the Hex come down on a Saturday? Well, that's tied to William Kaplan. So we learned that he was 13 when the Hex went down. He says, a lot happened to me at age 13 too. Because remember, he was celebrating his magic mitzvah on the day the Hex went down. And those are celebrated during Saturday morning services, and in particular, the Saturday following a child's Jewish birthday. Okay, so we can use this to figure out when William Kaplan was born. Because there's this really cool website, chabad.org, that lets you determine when someone's mitzvah date is based upon their actual birthday. So we're going to put in 10/29/2010, because remember, he was 13 in November of 2023. And that tells us that his mitzvah would be Sunday, November 5th. And since you celebrate those the next Saturday, look at that, there's November 11th that he would be celebrating it. Remember, that's the day the Hex went down. Okay, so his birthday could be as early as October 29th. And then the latest it could be is 11/4/2010, because that gives him a mitzvah date of November 11th, which means he would basically celebrate it on the day of his mitzvah. So let's hold on to this information, because this will help us in just a minute. But first, we have to take a quick look at this newspaper article titled Near Death in Westview, and it seems to be referring to Billy Kaplan's character, because Joe Locke plays him, but it doesn't really help us because the date is December 14th, 2023, and we know that he died on November 11th, 2023. So I guess they were writing about it a month later? Sure, why not? I mean, there was a lot going on in Westview for them to report on, so they must have finally got around to this story. Anyway, we now jump 3 years later, and William tells us that he is 16. Okay, this is why his birthday is so important, because we know that his birthday cannot be any earlier than October 29th, and not any later than November 4th. But that means there's no way that this show is happening any earlier than October 29th of 2026, because it's 3 years later, so 2026, and it can't be any earlier than October 29th. But this is all going to work out for a really nice placement. All right, so we know that Agatha has been under the spell for 3 years. You've been under the influence of another. They took your agency for 3 years. But that fits, because it's 3 years since WandaVision. So then we have this library card, which translates to Darkhold, and it wasn't checked out. It was stolen 3 years ago, which makes sense, because 3 years ago at the end of WandaVision, Wanda would have stolen the Darkhold from Agatha. So this continues to fit nicely with the show being in 2026. And then this is interesting. So when Agatha asks Herb, how long have I been living in this cesspool of a town? His answer is about 3 years. So everybody else is rounded to 3 years, but he's implying it might be a little less than 3 years. That's really important. And then he also says something helpful, that you haven't been yourself the past few days. In other words, no longer that nosy neighbor spell that she's been under for the past 3 years. Instead, you've started to act like you've been bit by the true crime bug. So the point is, she started acting like the detective in just the past few days. Now, I was hoping maybe this newspaper would help us, and it does help us that it gives a 2026 date. That's really cool, but it's in February, so it's nice that they kept it consistent with it being in 2026, but otherwise it does not help us with the placement. But this really helps. They were on the road for only 24 hours, so the entire show, all the episodes, take place over 1 day. That's wild. And then I do want to mention something else about the library card. It has on it some dates, but it's the date due. So in other words, it's when the Darkhold was supposed to come back again, which doesn't really tell us much. I mean, October 13th, January 21st for Agatha and Wanda, but we don't know how long they were allowed to keep the book out. Plus all these other dates are basically people's birthdays. So I don't think these dates help us at all. So then the question is, does the evidence box help us? Well, if we zoom in on the evidence box, you can see a November date. So that would make us think we might be in November, but it's important to keep in mind that even when she's out of the spell, there's still these evidence boxes sitting around, and they've got different dates, like August, May, etc. So I'm pretty sure the dates are all just random because she probably grabbed these out of the trash. So, okay, that doesn't help. Now maybe this calendar helps us on Lilia's wall. I mean, it does say November, but it's like from the 1940s. So I don't think we can trust anything in Lilia's house. All right. Finally, does this evidence bag help us? I mean, if we zoom in on this date here, and actually we have to flip it around so we can see it properly, it maybe has an October date, maybe, but it's really hard to tell. Okay, so now let's take a look at the weather. While Agatha's under the spell, it certainly looks like late fall. However, when she's in the real world, it looks more like early fall. I mean, the trees are just turning their leaves. And more importantly, these azaleas. I mean, we have Mrs. Hart planting azaleas, and she knows everything about planting, as we learn. And the best time to plant azaleas is late spring or early fall. So we're kind of getting a lot of things leaning towards an early fall time frame. So ultimately, I'm going to go with what Herb said. He said about 3 years. WandaVision was in early November of 2023. So I'm going to go with October of 2026 because I think Marvel wants this thing to be placed on Halloween, similar to how they placed Werewolf by Night on Halloween. Remember, the entire show happens over the course of one day. So my guess is that is October 31st of 2026. And that would make it just a few days after William Kaplan's birthday if his birthday was October 29th. So it all fits together perfectly. All right, so let's place this thing on the timeline. We have Agatha coming out of WandaVision, so we can go to the Phase 5 page. We can put on Agatha All Along, put in October of 2026, and bring in her line from WandaVision. Now, I will say up front, I like these dates. I think they're right. However, if you're somebody who chooses to put November for all three of these, basically because of Unity Day and Secret Invasion, and then everything else happening in pretty quick succession afterwards, I totally respect that. But I really like the dates of August, September, and October because it takes care of Kamala's birthday, and now I think it also lets Agatha All Along be on October 31st. All right, so now on to Daredevil Born Again, Season 1. All right, we're going to start with the fact that Nelson, Murdoch, and Page is still running full steam ahead, and remember, it had just started back up at the end of Daredevil Season 3. Then this comment is really helpful. So basically, Heather is talking about the fact that the force has dwindled by 30% in the last 2 years. Well, surely this statistic is starting after people came back from the blip. So that means we're 2 years after the blip in October of 2023, so we're now in October of 2025. Of course, Bullseye comes after Karen, ends up killing Foggy, and that results in Matt giving up the mask. We then jump to 1 year later, so I think we're in October of 2026. And people are saying that Daredevil has been gone a really long time, which is a whole year, basically. Also, we learned that Fisk didn't run for mayor in November of 2025, but he can run now because there's a recall election. So basically, people want to oust the current mayor. And there's been some very famous recall elections. The governor himself, Arnold Schwarzenegger, actually ousted the governor of California. Crazy stuff. So we also see the city council is looking to pass a tax break. If your transportation around the city is a bicycle, you could be eligible for a massive tax rebate this upcoming April. The measure goes before the city council this month. So obviously you have to pass something like this in the prior year for the tax break to take effect next year. So we're definitely in late 2026. So finally we see that Fisk returns after a long recovery. You can see his scar there from being shot by Echo, and you can see a lot more of his scar there. So Vanessa says, you left the bed I sat beside for months while you recovered. Of course, again, when he got shot by Echo. Then she says, and now you walk in here and try to end the meeting with the 5 families? Well, he says, well, you've kept them in line. They respect you. And she's like, look, I was broken. I was shattered. But he explains, for months I had to pull myself back together. And of course, he's referring to what Echo did to him. I mean, literally, she messed with him so bad that even though this was in May, June timeframe of 2025, he doesn't come back to Vanessa until October of 2026. Man, she messed with him bad. Anyway, she says, while you were gone, I made this business bulletproof. He explains that I now have the 25,000 signatures necessary to run in the recall race, right? And in fact, he declares his candidacy for the mayor of New York. And there's the newspaper articles about it. I love that people are like, why are we even talking about this? He supposedly crushed a guy's head. That is funny. Anyway, Fisk then says it was almost a year ago now when those cops in that bar were murdered by a vigilante. And of course, Foggy was murdered as well, right? This is referring to a year ago. And it is interesting he said almost a year because they already told us earlier that we moved a full year forward. So I still think we're in the October timeframe of 2026. Then we see from this news ticker that basically a leak left residents outside in the cold. So we're definitely in the winter timeframe. And then I love this meeting between Fisk and Matt. They say it's been a long time, and it sure has. They have not seen each other for a long time. Matt says, you've lost some weight, gained some muscle. Fisk says, I tried to mentor someone, but, and Matt jumps in with, didn't she shoot you in the head? And he just laughs. That's so awesome. Of course, they're referring once again to Echo. Then he says, I had nothing to do with his death, referring to Foggy. Okay, so now we see the race is too close to call, but then finally we learn that Wilson Fisk has been elected the 112th mayor of New York City. And this detail is so cool. So IRL, Eric Adams is the 110th mayor in New York City, and he has been since 2022. So in the MCU, presumably he lost the election in 2025, someone else became the 111th mayor, and then Wilson Fisk beat him in the recall election, becoming the 112th mayor. I love that. So then we have Fisk talking about how he's going to usher in a new dawn, and we move to New Year's celebration of 2027. So very cool. So then I really love this counseling session because it briefly recaps all that they've been through. So Vanessa says, my husband and I have been through a lot these last couple of years. So basically starting with him getting shot by Echo in the head. She says, until very recently, we ran a complex business, but then Wilson left, disappeared really. Of course, he left to go try to make up with Echo, and then she messed with his mind. He explains, I was assaulted by a vigilante, and the recovery process, it was quite involved. Sure it was, right? It took over a year, like we talked about. And then he says, I couldn't stay in touch with Vanessa. So yeah, summarizing all of their craziness in like 30 seconds. All right, so then we move to snowfall in New York, so we're definitely in the winter. And then episode 5 is on St. Patrick's Day. They mention, come on, girl, it's St. Patrick's Day. Just another Wednesday, love. Which I love this because, yes, in 2027, St. Patrick's Day is on a Wednesday. Perfect. Chef's kiss. Also, there's a reference to hockey games, and hockey is played from October through early April. So that fits with this being in the March timeframe. And then the Kingpin mentions that Daredevil vanished just over a year ago, which, because we're now in March of 2027, it has been over a year. And then this is important. So Muse goes after Heather, and remember, messes her up bad, cuts her arm up. Yet, we then jump forward to a point where she's healed up, at least healed up enough to go to this dance. Also, we jump forward to a point where the task force has been making progress. Vigilante crime is down by 30%. And also, Red Hook project is now fully funded. So I think we've jumped forward about a month from that March episode, St. Patrick's Day, and therefore we're in April of 2027. And in fact, I put together a pretty detailed summary of the timeline. I'm not going to read all that, but you can pause it and read it if you want. But yeah, we end up in April of 2027. All right, so let's add this to the timeline. So first, we have Punisher Season 2 down in the lower right-hand corner. We're back in Phase 3 at this point, but we need a line coming out of him. And then for Phase 4, he's just going to slide down the right side there. And then also, we're going to have Kingpin coming out of Echo and Daredevil coming out of She-Hulk. So now we can add in Daredevil Born Again. The dates are from October 2026 to April 2027. So now we can bring in the Punisher, Kingpin, and Daredevil. All right, so now we're on to Captain America Brave New World. And this movie did something I haven't seen in quite a while. It had a full date that was very, very visible. Thursday, April 16th, 2027. Now, it is worth noting that April 16th in 2027 is actually a Friday, but I think that's a result of the fact that the movie was delayed a year and was supposed to be in 2026 in the MCU, but now it was moved to 2027. In fact, we'll see one more issue with this a little bit later. But the important point is the main part of the movie is happening in April of 2027. But we have got to talk about this whole election situation. So we start with an election night victory party, and they're saying the next president of the United States of America is Thaddeus Ross. So if the main part of the movie is in 2027, then he must have won in the November 3rd, 2026 election. Of course, IRL, that is not a presidential election. There are elections every even-numbered year for the Congress, but president is 2028. So what is going on there? So the first question we have to ask is, was there a presidential election in 2024 in the MCU? Well, we have this Daily Bugle article, and these were all used to promote the movies, in this case, No Way Home. And if we look at the article, it starts by saying, did you make it to the polls this week? Our government is a bit distracted. counting the ballots. Okay, so we know there was an election in the MCU in 2024, but notice it doesn't say it's a presidential election. And again, there are congressional elections every even year. So that opens the door that the presidential elections could have shifted a bit in the MCU. In fact, we even have this strange situation. Notice this poster. It's very blurry, but it says Ross 25. So does this mean he actually won the election in 2025? No, I think this is another one of the remnants left behind from when the movie was delayed a year. But it does show that originally, I think he was going to win in 2025 and the movie was going to be in 2026. Isn't that crazy? So, all right, let's head back to this election night victory party, and we have Ross saying, "Tonight, America has spoken in one of the most important elections of our lifetimes." So there was definitely a presidential election in 2026 in the MCU, and we get further evidence of that when Ross says they said lose the mustache or lose the election. Okay, so let's try to figure out how on earth we can have a presidential election in the MCU in 2026, because obviously Ross would have beaten Ritson when Ritson ran for re-election. And we know that Ritson was able to run for re-election because he was in his first term, which was mentioned in Secret Invasion. And that's another reason why I would prefer not to use the Unity Day placement for Secret Invasion. If instead it's in September, as I'm proposing, that means this whole discussion with Fury was happening around 2 months before the actual election. So how exactly do we get a presidential election in 2026? So my theory is Trump was blipped, which would mean he was gone as of May of 2018. So what exactly happens if the president is blipped? Well, there is an order of presidential succession if a president cannot carry out the duties of the office, and obviously if you're blipped, you're unable to hold office. Now, there are 18 people that can take over should the president no longer be able to hold office, but I'm going to throw out that several of these might have been blipped, and then maybe whoever comes up on the list might not even want to be president or might not be qualified to be president. Because keep in mind, the world was a mess. You could see all these boats stuck in the harbor in New York, and then potentially half of the medical industry was blipped, half of the energy industry was blipped, half of the food industry was blipped. So I'm wondering if whoever became president didn't even want the office, right? So I'm going to throw out that the decision was made by Congress to change when the next presidential election would occur. Because keep in mind, it's just part of the Constitution and the various amendments, and we have had 27 amendments to the Constitution. So, running with that theory, that means Congress could have made it possible for there to be an election in November of 2018. And let's just say for fun, Biden won that. We don't know for sure. So he would have been president until January of 2023. So that would therefore make it possible for Ritson to run for election in November of 2022, because remember, we learned he wasn't blipped, and then that would set us up for an election cycle in November of 2026. I know that's kind of crazy, but I don't know how else to make it work. And by the way, can you imagine Trump coming back from the blip and not being president anymore? I would not want to be around that day. That would not be fun. All right, so that's my explanation for how we get a November 2026 election in the MCU. Then we jump 5 months later to April. And in fact, we see that mentioned here when Ross says, "I'm coming up on the end of my first 100 days." Well, Inauguration Day is January 20th, and 100 days after that would be Friday, April 30th of 2027. And of course, we saw earlier that we're in mid-April of 2027, so that fits perfectly. It also works well with cherry trees blooming in late March, so a mid-April timeframe works perfect. And then we get a lot of other timeline hints that work really nicely. So Sam and Torres have worked together for 3 years, and we saw that they were working together in spring of 2024, so that's great. And it fits nicely with the fact that it's been 2 years after Isaiah was exonerated, because the newscast is saying Isaiah Bradley is set to go before a military judge tomorrow, just 2 years after being exonerated for unjust charges. And of course, he was exonerated in the summer of 2024, so it's almost 3 years, but it's still 2, so that fits. And then we see that Ross kept the leader prisoner for 16 years. Once Ross discovered how useful I could be, and that's important, he kept me here for 16 years. Now, of course, that's referring back to the first Incredible Hulk movie, which was spring of 2010, so really technically 17 years. But that just means Stearns was likely in prison for around a year before Ross realized just how valuable he could be. Now, we also learn the Avengers are no longer a group, because Ross says, "Which is why I want you, Captain America, to help me rebuild the Avengers." And Sam retorts by saying, "When you passed the Sokovia Accords, you tore the Avengers apart." So just think about that. That means that ever since Endgame, there has not been a formal Avengers group meeting. And in fact, ever since Civil War, the Avengers haven't really existed. That is insanity. Okay, so now let's talk about Bucky and everything we learn about him. So we find out he's running for Congress. He says, I have a campaign fundraiser. It's so stupid. And we learn that he is the future Congressman James Buchanan Barnes. So that means he's already won at this point. He just hasn't been officially read into office. And in fact, I think he probably won a special election, which is basically used to replace officials who have resigned, died, or been removed from office. So in other words, it doesn't have to be a normal election cycle. So that means he must have won, but isn't officially in Congress yet. And then we also get some mixed messages about his age. So Sam says he's 110 years old, and this is in April of 2027. However, Bucky himself said he's 106 in April of 2024 during Falcon and the Winter Soldier. So I guess depending on when his birthday is, this may or may not be accurate. So one of the two times, it is probably not his correct age. So let's look at when he was born. Well, that's pretty easy. The Winter Soldier movie tells us he was born in 1917, but it also tells us he was born in 1916. So this dude is a real mystery, right? And plus, for him to be 110 in 2027 means that he's counting his blip years, which is kind of cheating. Well, or is it? Because he's also counting the years that he was frozen by Hydra. So yeah, it's just really hard to figure out what this dude's age is. And let's throw in the fact that in the Thunderbolts, he said he was 90 in May of 2012, because Val's assistant says, I was in high school when the aliens came, and he responds with, high school, huh? I was like 90. Well, that doesn't work, because that would mean he would be born in 1922. Well, or does it work? Because there are props, which weren't actually shown in the movie, so you never know whether we can trust props, but notice, his birthday was 1922. I don't know, man. I think Bucky's just messing with us. I think he makes up a different age every time he appears. So maybe someone can make this all work out, but for now, I'm just going to let Bucky be Bucky. But we do get a nice touch regarding Ross's age. In a deleted scene from The Incredible Hulk, he says, when I came back from Vietnam, I was 27, but I looked like I was 45. So big thanks to Will Peak for pointing out that this aligns perfectly with something we learn in Brave New World, because in the medical history report for Ross, we see that he was born in 1945. And if you do the math, that works perfectly with him coming back from Vietnam around 1972, and of course all the troops were brought back in 1973. So really nice, and thank you, Will, for pointing that out. So now we can add Brave New World to the timeline. So first we need a line coming out of Falcon and the Winter Soldier for Sam and Bucky, and then I'm going to go ahead and add a line coming out of Eternals for Tiamat. I don't know whether we're ever going to see anybody from that movie again. I hope we do, but just in case we don't, we want that line. All right, so then we can add Brave New World to the timeline. April of 2027 is when it happens, and then here's Sam and Bucky, and here's Tiamat. All right, so now we move on to the Thunderbolts. So the only real timeline indicator that we get regarding the month is these trees that we see. This definitely looks like an October-ish time frame. Here again, we see trees looking definitely fall-like. And we can tell it's happening after Brave New World because the Washington Monument is still under repair after the Red Hulk, nearly wiped it out, right? We also see that Bucky is an official congressman now. He's got his official pin, which look very much like the ones IRL. And we see that Val gives the Red Hulk a shout out. Our last president turned into a bright red superhuman monster that almost destroyed the city. Of course, I really want to know who the president is now after Ross had to step down, but I guess we'll have to wait to find that out. And we see that the Avengers are not coming, even though Ross asked Sam to form them during Brave New World. So anyway, we know it's after that movie, so I'm going to go with an October 2027 time frame, and we'll see if other things fit with that as well. So I want to point out, Val has thrown a first responders family fundraiser, and I'm mentioning that because I could have sworn from the trailers that this was going to be a May time frame, thus like May 2027 for the 15th anniversary of the Battle of New York. But instead, it's just a first responders family fundraiser, so I'm still going to stick with October for the month. All right, we see that Walker's downfall was a few short years ago. He's doom scrolling on his phone, and sure enough, it says the story of what went wrong starts long before his unveiling just a few short years ago. So that was in 2024 with Falcon and the Winter Soldier, so it fits perfectly with us being in October of 2027. We also see that while Bucky is indeed a congressman, he hasn't passed any bills yet because Val's assistant is saying the Avengers are gone, no one's coming to save the day. He says, I think we are. We could be the people that are coming. And she says, is that coming from the freshman congressman that hasn't got a bill passed or the Winter Soldier? So that means he's in office but hasn't been there long enough to pass any bills. And then Val even makes a crack about him not making it a full year as a congressman. She says, I never really thought you'd have a promising political career, but less than half a term? Yikes. So that's helpful because the House of Representatives serves 2-year terms, meaning he's been in office less than a year. So all of this fits perfectly with an October 2027 timeframe for the movie. Okay, so let's put this one on the timeline. So first we need a line coming out of Black Widow for Red Guardian. Then we need a line coming out of Ant-Man and the Wasp for the Ghost. Okay, so we move to Phase 4, and on the left-hand side, we'll do those 2 lines for Red Guardian and Ghost. Then we need a line coming out of Falcon and the Winter Soldier for U.S. Agent, and we need a line coming out of Hawkeye for Yelena. All right, so we finally get to the Phase 5 page. We can put in Thunderbolts. I'm going with October of 2027. We can bring in all those characters from the earlier phases, and we can connect Bucky in from Captain America Brave New World. But we do need to talk about the big jump forward in that post-credit scene. We jump 14 months later, so what on earth is going on with that? Well, if the Thunderbolts is in October 2027, then my guess is that's going to put Doomsday 14 months later in December of 2028, and probably Secret Wars will happen around that same time frame. So why are they wanting it to be in 2028? Well, I think that's because it's a solid 20 years since the debut of Iron Man, but also when Iron Man takes place in the MCU timeline. It's just perfect. Another advantage to this gap is it lets Marvel fit in a bunch of entries before Doomsday happens in the timeline. Now granted, X-Men 97 and Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, they're in a different universe. Marvel Zombies is a what-if branch, and Eyes of Wakanda is historical. It's going to tell the history of Wakanda, so it's happening much earlier. But there are a lot of entries that still need to be fit in before Doomsday happens in the timeline. We know Wonder Man's coming out this year. Daredevil Born Again Season 2 is happening next year. Brand New Day is now officially a prequel to Doomsday, so it needs to fit in. And then I'm going to bet that both Vision Quest and hopefully we're getting it, please, Champions, will happen before Doomsday in the timeline. We'll just have to wait and see. Plus, there's at least 2 open movie slots. I'm not sure whether they'll be filled at all, but if they are, those need to happen before Doomsday. So yeah, this 14-month gap makes a lot of sense when you think about all these things that need to fit in. And then we got to talk about that post-credit scene, the big multiversal crossover that I think is probably one of the first scenes of Doomsday. So they see an extra-dimensional ship entering the atmosphere. They comment on how it's such a cool ship. And sure enough, it turns out to be the Fantastic Four's ship. And of course, we'll learn a little bit more about that when the Fantastic Four movie comes out and kicks off Phase 6. But speaking of the multiverse, now we need to talk about how those multiversal Phase 5 entries fit into the timeline. So we're talking about Deadpool and Wolverine, Loki Season 2, What If Season 2 and 3, the ending of the Marvels with that awesome X-Men scene, and of course the post-credit scenes of Quantumania. Now admittedly, there is no way we would know how the multiversal entries fit in with the overall timeline if not for this season-by-season breakdown provided on Marvel.com. And notice they keep updating it. Latest date is June 12th, 2025, when they added Brave New World. So we just have to trust this as gospel, that we have the Marvels, Loki Season 2, What If Season 2, Deadpool and Wolverine, then Agatha, and finally What If Season 3. Okay, so let me try to take this and make it make sense. All right, so let's talk about how 616 and 10005, the X-Men universe, are connected. So I have done extensive videos on the X-Men timeline. You can check those out if you want, but I'm just going to focus on Deadpool 2, X-Men Days of Future Past, After the Reset, and Logan. So we know that Logan happens in the Deadpool 2 timeline because even in Deadpool 2, he's making jokes about Logan dying, right? And I think he knows about it because in the No Good Deed video, we see him passing by a movie theater where they're literally playing Logan. So, he's a fourth wall breaker. He can pretty much do whatever he wants, and he knows that Logan dies in the future. And in fact, in Deadpool and Wolverine, he even verifies that by going to the future with a TVA temp pad and finding out Logan died. All right, so that's important. The next important thing is Wade visited the main 616, and he did it in 2018. So we're going to see that both 616 and 10005 are in sync in their timelines because Wade goes to visit Happy, right? And they tell us it's Earth 616, the sacred timeline. They even tell us it's March of 2018. So basically right before Infinity War. Now, supposedly, Wade does this using Cable's time device. I say supposedly because essentially Cable himself explained that it just lets you slide through time, not necessarily to jump to different timelines, let alone different universes. But again, it's Deadpool. The dude can do whatever he wants. So again, Wade visits 616 in 2018. Then we learn that his universe advances 6 years later. So that means Deadpool and Wolverine is taking place in 2024, basically 1 year after the reset that we saw at the end of Days of Future Past in 2023. So now we need to go back to the sacred timeline. We basically need to advance it forward through Infinity War and through Endgame. And of course, as a result of Endgame, it spawns a Loki variant that shows up in Loki Season 1. Then if we go to the season-by-season breakdown, we see that the Marvels actually happens before Loki Season 2. I know that seems crazy, but hang with me. I'm going to try to make it make sense. So we need to add on the Marvels in 2026, and then I will just bet that Monica in that post-credit scene heads to the same 10005 that we saw in Days of Future Past and we saw in Deadpool and Wolverine. So we'll have to wait and find out on that, but that would happen in 2026 in Deadpool's universe. Okay, but that raises the question, did Monica show up in 10005 before or after the TVA? Because remember, Wade's saying 6 years ago you'd all be dead, and of course he blows out the candle, and the knock at the door occurs, and in comes the TVA. So did Monica show up before or after that? Well, we're going to have to add Loki Season 2 to the timeline before we can answer that. So we know that Loki Season 2 ends after the Marvels, and then of course he creates the tree at the end of Loki Season 2. So how on earth can Loki Season 1 and Season 2 be running parallel to events in 616? That seems to make no sense. So I think from the moment that the Loki variant was pulled out of 616 and into the TVA, it synced up the TVA's timeline with that of 616. And in fact, if we look in the timeline book, we can see evidence of that. Notice at the top, we see Endgame, and then Loki is pulled out of 616 into the TVA, and we now see a TVA timeline. Then if we continue to go through the timeline book, we see that the TVA timeline is happening in sync with 616. On the left, we see events at the TVA, but on the right, we see the events of Endgame. And it continues on with the line on the top indicating the TVA moves forward in time as Endgame is wrapping up. And then finally, we see that line ending right before WandaVision starts. So it only makes sense that Loki Season 2 picks up right after that point and continues to run in sync with what's happening in 616. But wait, how can that be, you might ask? Didn't Loki Season 2 literally span centuries? I mean, remember, Loki said, "OB, how long will it take me to know everything you know about mechanics, physics, and engineering? Let's assume I don't know much, but I'm a fast learner and I'm a god." And then he asked, would it be decades? And OB says, centuries. And we literally see a time card saying centuries later. But remember, Loki kept reliving the same day over and over again, learning a little bit more each time, very similar to what we saw in Groundhog Day. Bill Murray's character learned to play piano by reliving the same day over and over again. So for him, it might have been months, who knows, maybe years, but for everybody else, only 1 day passed. That's the same way Loki Season 2 was handled. So we know that centuries didn't go by, but of course it's really hard to know exactly how much time went by because even Mobius said it's hard to say, time passes differently here in the TVA. But what we do know is Loki Season 1 and Season 2 are happening in sync with the main events of 616. Okay, so now we have to talk about the fact that Paradox chose to go to 2024 during Deadpool and Wolverine. So basically he went back in time. But then that makes sense, right? We've seen the TVA go to 1982. We've seen them go to 1977. We've even seen them jump to 2050. So basically, the TVA can go wherever they want in the timelines, and maybe Paradox chose 2024 because he felt that was a low point for Wade when he would be easier to manipulate. All right, so also keep in mind that at the end of Deadpool and Wolverine, the entire universe was rebooted. Remember, it got down to 1%, and then B-15 said, do you see that? Your universe is regenerating. Whatever you did here, you not only saved your world, you spared your timeline from extinction. So basically, 10005 was reset. And I think that's how they're going to explain that the Wolverine on the left from Days of Future Past has been replaced with the one from the movie. Likewise, X-23 has also been replaced with the one from the movie. And it even allows for characters that have died, like Mystique, to now be alive again since everything was rebooted, and we know that she's going to be in Doomsday thanks to the Chair Watch. So yeah, I think the reboot of the universe makes total sense. Okay, so let's try to summarize this quickly because I know it is kind of confusing. So we have the beginning of the Deadpool and Wolverine movie, then suddenly Paradox shows up, Deadpool ultimately steals the TVA device to verify that Logan is dead, then the rest of the movie occurs, including the entire reboot of the universe. That's when I think the Marvel's post-credit scene ends and Monica shows up in 10005. So when we see that story pick up, we're going to have the rebooted X-Men surrounding Monica. So I hope that makes sense. It's pretty crazy, I know, but it works. It actually works. It's just a little wonky. Okay, so a last few things to discuss. We know the TVA is looking for variants because they mentioned I got those reports of variants of He Who Remains. Do any of them know that we exist? Nope. And then they mentioned the events of Quantumania because they say one of them caused a little bit of a ruckus on the 616 adjacent realm, referring to the quantum realm, but they handled it, so we're good for now. So I know that they're referring to this event where the Kang was killed, I guess. We'll have to wait and see whether he comes back or not, but it kind of seems like we won't see Kang anymore. But then again, I do hope they resolve all of these variants and, of course, all of these variants. So maybe Dr. Doom's going to show up in Doomsday and wipe them all out, but it's just something to keep in mind that theoretically they're all still out there. Also, one big question as we're approaching the Fantastic Four movie is, will the Watcher appear? Because in What If Season 3, he mentions that he helped Reed Richards. Of course, also Nick Fury and Madison, the GOAT Madison, but most importantly, Reed Richards. So we'll have to wait and see how this might affect the Fantastic Four movie. But now it's time to add the rest of the entries to our timeline. So we need a line coming off of Loki Season 1 and a line coming off of What If Season 1. We can move to the Phase 5 portion of our timeline, add in Loki Season 2, which of course is happening at the TVA, and our connection with Loki Season 1. And we can add in What If Season 2, which of course is connected to What If Season 1, but it is now branches off of Loki's tree, so we can add a connection to Loki Season 2. Then we can add Deadpool and Wolverine, which is in October 2024, and then we can add in our connection with the TVA, and then of course we can add What If Season 3, which is part of Loki's tree and is connected back to Loki Season 2. Wow. What a crazy timeline, right? But it actually makes sense. When you lay it all out, it actually does make sense. So I'll store a copy of this on my Google Drive, and I'll leave a pinned comment with a link in case you want to download it. Thank you so much for going on this adventure with me. It was a lot of fun trying to put the Phase 5 timeline together. And by the way, leave any comments if you think I got anything wrong, because you know I love to read and respond to everything. Also, don't forget, we have the July contest. Be a subscriber, leave a comment, win a book or a steelbook. And we have the membership option in case you're interested in that. And I always love to mention the Discord. Here's where Chris was sharing that awesome information about the Secret Invasion timeline. Also, I promised I would talk about the Doomsday Countdown Watch. Every day listed here at 7 p.m. Eastern, we'll be watching a different movie or show as we prepare for the December 18th, 2026 release of Doomsday. So we have 2,300 members across the globe, conversations 24/7, and I'll leave a pinned comment so you can join us. Also, if you don't mind, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. You can check out more content, and we'll all continue to enjoy the ever-growing, the ever-changing Marvel Cinematic Universe.